They called her just a nurse. Dr. Hargrove watched her correct her residence for placement without speaking, and his jaw tightened. He didn't know. Nobody knew. The scars on her forearms beneath her scrubs weren't trembling hands, they were muscle memory waiting. The Pentagon didn't call civilian hospitals in Savannah. They called her. What happened when they did would change everything. Katie Morrison had been at Sacred Heart for 6 months, and the emergency department ran like a machine that didn't know it was broken. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electrical hymn above the triage desk, casting everything in that particular hospital white that made blood look darker and skin look grayer than it actually was. She moved through the controlled chaos with the kind of efficiency that came from somewhere else, somewhere the other nurses couldn't quite place, the way she positioned her body to block a patient's view of their own injury, the way her hands moved on their own when someone flatlined, the way she knew exactly which vein would hold before she even reached for the needle. The antiseptic smell hung in the air like it always did, sharp and chemical, mixed with something underneath that never quite washed away, old fear, maybe, or the ghost of every crisis that had unfolded within these walls. Katie's locker on the 3rd floor contained the usual debris of a working nurse, a spare pair of clogs, 3 granola bars she kept meaning to eat, a photograph in a cracked frame of 2 women in desert camouflage standing in front of a convoy truck, and tucked in the very bottom, a pair of boots. Combat boots. The leather was worn soft as cloth, creased in all the places leather wasn't supposed to crease, the laces replaced twice with paracord because the originals had been cut away in a Chinook helicopter over Helmand Province 11 years ago. She kept meaning to throw them away. She couldn't. The scar tissue on her forearms was something she'd learned not to think about. Small white lines, almost invisible unless you looked for them, the kind of marks that came from shrapnel or glass or the edge of a surgical tray that had been dropped during a firefight. The nurses at Sacred Heart didn't ask about them. Nurses learned not to ask. What they noticed instead was that Katie Morrison could place an IV in a patient whose veins had collapsed from septic shock on the first stick, that she could anticipate a doctor's next move before he did, that she could recognize the particular sound a ventilator made when it was about to fail before the monitor alarmed. Dr. Hargrove had run the emergency department like a fiefdom for 15 years. That was his word for it, delivered with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been challenged successfully enough to stop using it. He believed in hierarchy the way some people believed in God, absolutely, fundamentally, with the kind of certainty that made any contradiction feel like blasphemy. The nurses worked for him. Not with him. For him. They fetched, they deferred, they made his coffee the way he preferred it, which was exactly the way he'd told them to make it. When he spoke during rounds, they listened. When he asked for something, they anticipated. When he decided something, they accepted it without the small heresy of a suggestion. Then Katie Morrison suggested an alternative diagnosis during morning rounds, and something in Hargrove's face went very still. It was a straightforward case on the surface, 53-year-old male with chest pain, elevated troponin, classic presentation. Dr. Hargrove had already made the diagnosis. Acute coronary syndrome. The patient was getting cardiac catheterization in 17 minutes. The interventional cardiologist was scrubbing in. The pathway was clear. The hierarchy was intact. And then Katie, organizing the patient's chart with her usual quiet precision, said 2 words that weren't her turn to say. Pulmonary embolism. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them like insects trapped in plastic. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from the ICU bay behind them. Every sound in the emergency department seemed to sharpen and crystallize. Hargrove's eyes moved to Katie with the slow deliberation of a predator registering movement in grass. His voice came out smooth as silk and cold as a surgical instrument that had been left in a freezer overnight. I'm sorry. Did you have a thought? Katie didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Her hands continued organizing the chart, her movements precise and economical. She was a woman whose body had learned not to betray her a long time ago. D-dimer came back at 2.8. CT isn't showing significant blockage on the coronary angiography protocol. But her unilateral leg swelling started 3 days ago. Right calf. She mentioned it when we were taking history. The resident, a young man named Chen who had something to prove and not enough experience to know which battles mattered, watched this exchange with the kind of panic that came from witnessing a subordinate contradict someone who believed in hierarchies. Hargrove's smile appeared like a knife sliding between ribs, practiced, deliberate, designed to hurt. How fascinating. When medical school added a nursing component that I missed, I'll be sure to update my credentials. He turned to Chen without giving Katie another glance. Prepare for cardiac cath. The patient is having an MI. That's what elevated troponin means. Katie met Hargrove's eyes for exactly one breath. Her composure was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to you. It made something in his face tighten, because he could feel it, this inexplicable steadiness, and he hated things he couldn't control. He walked away. 45 minutes later, the CT came back. Massive bilateral pulmonary embolism. The patient was alive because Katie Morrison had noticed what the attending physician had missed, and now Hargrove had a problem worse than any patient outcome report. He had a nurse who was more competent than his hierarchy allowed her to be. A nurse who didn't defer. A nurse who suggested diagnoses that proved correct. A nurse whose quiet competence threatened the 15-year architecture of control that he'd built in this department, and he would not tolerate it. The next morning, he started early. Katie was arranging equipment in the trauma bay, the crash cart positioned exactly where she could reach it, the medication drawers stocked with what she'd learned from experience was more efficient than the official protocol. He watched her from the entrance, observed the economy of her movements, the way she positioned everything without seeming to think about it. Her hands, he noticed, bore the faint white scarring that you didn't get from nursing school simulations or routine patient care. Those scars came from somewhere else. Somewhere military. Somewhere the Pentagon sent people. He didn't wonder about it. He didn't care. All he cared about was the fact that she was a threat, and threats needed to be eliminated. You'll need to shadow Dr. Chen on surgical consults, he said, appearing beside her with a kind of abruptness designed to make her startle. She didn't. Hospital policy. New nurses need supervision. Katie didn't point out that she'd been at Sacred Heart for 6 months, or that she'd already performed successfully on 17 surgical consults, or that the hospital policy he was citing didn't exist. She simply nodded, her expression blank, and said, "Understood, doctor." But that wasn't the worst part. That was just the beginning. By noon, Hargrove had spoken to the charge nurse about concerns regarding Katie's scope of practice. By afternoon, he'd mentioned to 3 different attending physicians that she seemed to have boundary issues. By the time the evening shift arrived, he'd requested that she no longer participate in rounds, citing unspecified concerns about her training. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make accusations. He simply explained, with the kind of casual authority that came from running something for 15 years, that the new civilian nurse needed closer supervision, and perhaps her suggestions had been educated guesses rather than actual clinical reasoning. The other nurses, Katie understood, had already learned the cost of contradicting him. They gave her wider berth. They didn't meet her eyes during shift change. They were protecting themselves the only way they knew how, by creating distance between themselves and anyone who might draw his attention next. In her locker, the combat boots sat untouched. She'd learned, a long time ago, that some things you carried with you forever. Not because they served a purpose anymore, but because they reminded you of who you'd been when you were willing to die for something. It was 2:06 a.m. when the phone call came through to the emergency department. A transfer from Walter Reed. A Navy captain. Helmand Province. Medical evacuation. Mysterious internal injuries. The details came through fragmented, urgent, the voice on the line clipped with the kind of precision that came from military communication protocols. Katie heard it from across the trauma bay and something in her posture changed, just barely perceptible, a realignment of her spine, a sharpening of focus. The boots in her locker suddenly felt very close. The captain arrived by ambulance 17 minutes later, unconscious, his body bearing the kind of trauma that didn't make sense on the initial assessment. No obvious penetrating wounds. No fractures. But his blood pressure was dropping, his oxygen saturation was borderline, and the surgical resident who'd come down from Walter Reed to accompany him was looking at the Sacred Heart team with the kind of barely concealed doubt that came from knowing you were handing off your patient to people who had no idea what they were walking into. Blast radius, the Walter Reed resident said quietly, to no one in particular. IED. He was lucky. His team wasn't. Hargrove appeared within minutes, as if summoned by the presence of someone important enough to matter. A captain. Military. The kind of patient whose outcome would be documented, reviewed, discussed in the kind of circles where Hargrove needed to maintain his reputation. He stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing the scans with the kind of intense focus that meant he was already calculating blame distribution if things went wrong. Katie prepared the equipment. Moved the crash cart closer. Verified the for access with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory so old it predated her current life. And when the surgical resident from Walter Reed glanced up and watched her work, something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or the specific kind of surprise that comes from seeing someone do something with such absolute competence that it seemed impossible they were doing it at all. He watched Katie's hands move. Watched the way she knew exactly which monitor setting would show the damage they couldn't see yet. Watched her position the ultrasound with the deliberate accuracy of someone who'd done this under fire. And when the resident leaned toward his attending physician and whispered, his voice carried just far enough for Katie to hear, "Where did a civilian learn to operate like a combat medic?" She didn't respond. She simply continued her work, her composure unshakable, her hand steady as a surgical laser, as if the question had never been asked at all. The surgical resident's question hung in the air like the antiseptic smell that never quite faded from the trauma bay. Katie continued working without acknowledgement, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory deeper than any civilian nursing program could teach. She had learned to answer questions that way, silence as deflection, competence as camouflage. The resident would forget eventually. They all did. What she didn't know was that Dr. Hargrove had already begun watching her more closely. The cafeteria at Sacred Heart operated on strict hierarchies. Attendings claimed the corner table by the windows. Residents and fellows occupied the middle zone. Nurses, even the competent ones, especially the competent ones, took their meals in the back near the service line, where conversation stayed quiet and nobody made eye contact with the doctors. Katie understood the unspoken rules. She had survived far worse than institutional posturing. A hospital hierarchy was just another chain of command, and she knew how to walk those chains without drawing attention. On Wednesday, during lunch rush, she moved through the cafeteria with her tray balanced on one hand, muscle memory from years of eating standing up in transport planes and field tents. The dining room smelled like overcooked vegetables and the metallic tang of commercial gravy. Attendings' laughter carried across the space, that particular timber of men who believed their rank made them untouchable. Dr. Hargrove sat at the physician's table, his back to her, speaking to the trauma surgeon across from him. Katie would later think about the moment he heard her approach, the exact second his jaw tightened because he recognized the sound of her footsteps moving with too much authority, carrying themselves like someone who didn't shuffle. Like someone who had never learned to apologize for taking up space. His foot came up without warning. The tray caught on his extended leg, a casual hook, almost lazy in its execution. But the violence of it landed hard. Katie's lunch scattered across the tile floor like shrapnel, a ceramic plate shattering, green beans and mashed potatoes spreading in an abstract pattern, silverware clattering against the hard floor in a sound like ammunition being dropped. The entire cafeteria went quiet. 50 people, maybe more, stopped mid-conversation and turned to watch. Hargrove didn't even turn around. He simply withdrew his foot and returned to his conversation as if nothing had happened, his voice picking up exactly where it had left off. The sepsis protocol is overused. Half my residents couldn't identify a straightforward infection if their licenses depended on it. Katie stood motionless for 3 seconds. Around her, the room held its breath like a collective inhalation, waiting to see what the small civilian nurse would do. Someone whispered. Someone else almost laughed, then caught themselves. She took one measured breath. Just one. Her diaphragm filled slowly, deliberately, the kind of breath she had learned to take before breaching a compound or stepping into hostile territory. A single tear escaped from her left eye, not from hurt, but from the sheer effort of restraint, the pressure valve that came from holding everything back. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove's profile, her jaw clamped tight enough to grind bone. When she spoke, her voice came out devastatingly calm. Flat. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. I've had worse thrown at me by better men. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ventilation system seemed to pause. The attending surgeon across from Hargrove actually set down his fork. One of the residents actually looked impressed. And Hargrove's shoulders stiffened, his hands going rigid against the table because he recognized something in that voice, some quality that didn't match the job title on her badge. He turned to look at her then, really look, and Katie saw the moment his face shifted from contempt to something closer to professional alarm. She had said too much. She had let something slip through the careful construction of civilian nurse, civilian identity, civilian insignificance. She knelt and began gathering the scattered food with steady hands, paper towels appearing from nowhere as a junior resident hurried over to help. Katie waved her off with a single gesture, not unkind, just decisive. She cleaned her own mess. She always had. By the time she stood, her expression had reset to something appropriately neutral, appropriately humble. The breach was sealed. But Hargrove watched her leave the cafeteria, his eyes tracking her back with a new intensity that Katie felt like crosshairs. The attending physicians laughed nervously at something he said, though she didn't hear what. Laughter that sounded like it was meant to diminish whatever they had just witnessed, to sort it back into familiar categories. Just a nurse who got lucky with a comeback. Just an employee being put in her place. The natural order reasserting itself. 2 days later, the order started cracking. During morning rounds, Katie stood at the nurse's station reviewing labs for a sepsis case when she noticed the blood culture results contradicting the clinical picture. The patient presented with fever, elevated white count, and confusion, textbook sepsis. But the culture was growing something unexpected, something that wouldn't respond to the broad-spectrum antibiotics Hargrove had ordered. A fungal infection. Histoplasmosis, probably, given the patient's recent travel history to the Ohio River Valley. She had seen it before, not in civilian practice, but in the field. Birds. Fungal spores. The kind of diagnosis that got missed in comfortable hospitals where doctors didn't have to think about environmental exposures in rural areas. She approached the rounds team carefully, respectfully. Quietly, because that's what the hospital expected from her. Doctor, the culture results came back. I was wondering if we should consider fungal coverage, given the patient's Ohio residence. Hargrove didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her with an expression that managed to be both dismissive and intensely focused, the way a predator might study prey that had just moved wrong. Then he turned back to the attending surgeon and continued speaking about something completely unrelated, his voice carrying across the hallway where everyone could hear. The problem with nursing education is that it makes certain people overconfident. They read a textbook chapter and suddenly they're diagnosticians. The attending surgeon said nothing. But Katie saw the resident check the chart. Saw her frown as she reviewed the culture results. The labs confirmed the fungal infection by afternoon. At evening rounds, when the entire team gathered at the nurse's station, Hargrove found the moment. Katie's patient chart sat in a neat stack on the counter, the documentation she had meticulously completed, the observations she had recorded, the vital sign trends she had tracked. Hargrove picked them up, walked to where she stood, and threw them at her feet. Papers scattered like leaves. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the sudden silence that followed. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying the kind of contempt that sounded almost friendly if you didn't listen too carefully. Nurse's chart. Doctors diagnose. Katie knelt. Around her, the attending physicians shifted uncomfortably, their eyes finding the floor or the ceiling, anywhere except her face. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended her. The hierarchy was reasserting itself, and publicly contradicting Hargrove meant risking their own position. She understood. She had served in organizations where rank determined truth, and she knew the calculus of professional survival. She gathered the papers with steady hands, stacking them in order without rushing, her movements precise and unhurried. A civilian nurse might have trembled. A civilian nurse might have apologized. Katie simply worked, her face carefully blank, while Hargrove announced to the assembled staff, "I'll bet anyone here she quits within a week." "Any takers?" Laughter followed. A few nervous responses. Someone actually said $5 says she makes it to Wednesday. The attending surgeon didn't laugh, just returned to reviewing the chart, where the fungal coverage Hargrove had eventually ordered was already showing improvement because a nurse had done his job for him. That night, Katie sat in the break room well after her shift ended, staring at her locker. The contents had become a careful study in invisibility: one extra set of scrubs, a cracked ceramic mug she'd had since before Savannah, a dying plant that someone had given her in her first week and that she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Beneath them, wrapped in newspaper and tucked into the corner where nobody would look, her pair of worn combat boots. Desert bandana recondos that had walked through Helmand province and 3 other places she wouldn't name, even in her own thoughts. The leather was scuffed. The laces were held together with paracord. They smelled like dust and memory and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from carrying lives in your hands. A surgical resident she recognized from the captain's intake appeared in the break room doorway, surprise crossing his features when he saw her. "You're still here." Katie closed her locker without answering the question beneath the question. "Long night. Rough transfer. Military patient, complex case." He paused, watching her with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was still thinking about something he couldn't quite name. "How long have you been a nurse?" Katie met his eyes. Held them steady. "Long enough." The resident nodded slowly, like he was filing something away for later examination. But the captain was already in ICU on Hargrove's orders, held overnight instead of going directly to surgery, and the resident's pager would call him back to the floor before he could ask the question she saw forming behind his eyes. Katie closed her locker, gathered her things, and walked out into the Savannah night, where the heat pressed down like a physical weight and nobody would see the tears she didn't let fall until she was alone in her car, her hands finally trembling because she was off the clock, off the stage, off the line where composure was survival. The next morning, Hargrove would make his next move. But that night, Katie Morrison sat in the darkness with her hands shaking, understanding with absolute clarity that staying invisible was no longer going to be possible. The pager exploded at 0200 hours. Katie's eyes snapped open in the darkness of the on-call room, her hand already moving toward the device before her brain caught up. ICU code blue. The captain. Not assigned to that floor. Didn't matter. She was moving before the second alert fired. The hallways of Sacred Heart at 2 in the morning were a different hospital entirely, fluorescent strips casting everything in that particular shade of institutional gray that made time feel suspended, unreliable. Katie's boots hit the tile in a steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of someone who'd walked toward worse in the dark. The ICU doors slid open with a hydraulic whisper, and she could already hear it, the alarm screaming, the ventilator cycling in panic, the young nurse at the bedside saying, "I don't know what's happening," over and over like a prayer that wasn't working. The captain lay still, his chest heaving against the restraints of consciousness and machinery. His oxygen saturation was dropping, 89, 87, 84. The numbers on the monitor ticked downward like a countdown nobody wanted to watch. His jugular veins were distended, bulging against his neck like something trying to escape, and his breathing had taken on that desperate shallow quality that meant his body was running out of options. Katie saw it immediately. The left side of his chest was silent when she listened. No breath sounds. The right side compensating, working overtime. And his blood pressure was cratering, 78/52. His pupils were dilating. His skin had gone the color of wet concrete. Tension pneumothorax. His left lung had collapsed, and the air trapped outside the lung was compressing his heart, squeezing it like a fist slowly closing. In the field, she'd seen this happen 3 times. All 3 soldiers had survived because she had been there in the first 60 seconds. After that window closed, the body decided for you. Who paged the attending? Katie's voice didn't match her face. Her face was calm as still water. Her voice was already moving 3 steps ahead. I did. 5 minutes ago. And the on-call. Anne. Page them again. Code blue, tension pneumo, ETA on physician. The young nurse stared at her, mouth open. I don't know if you're supposed to. Katie reached for the phone herself and punched the code. Dr. Harris, on call. The phone rang. And rang. And rang. She hung up and dialed again. Orthopedic surgery. Wrong floor, but they answered. On-call attending for medicine. Emergency. ICU bed 4. He's in surgery, the voice said. EMR shows he's in the OR. The captain's O2 was at 81 now. His heart rate was climbing toward 160. His systolic pressure had dropped another 5 points. The room felt like it was tilting. Katie set down the phone and looked at the young nurse. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Prep alcohol and iodine. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Wait, what? The nurse's voice cracked. You're a nurse. You can't. He's going to die in the next 4 minutes without decompression. Katie's hands were already moving, already pulling on fresh gloves with the sound of rubber snapping in the silence. I can do this. Get me the needle. The girl, she couldn't have been more than 23, for months out of school maybe, stared at Katie like she was watching someone shed a skin. But something in Katie's face, something in the absolute absence of doubt, made her move. She was back in 15 seconds with the needle, her hands trembling as she prepped the site with the orange-brown iodine solution. Katie's hands weren't trembling. They were moving like they'd done this yesterday, like they'd done this 100 times while the world was on fire around her. Muscle memory. The kind that lived in bone and scar tissue, that didn't care what decade it was or what uniform you weren't wearing anymore. She felt the needle pierce the skin. The intercostal space was where she needed to be, just above the 3rd rib, where the air pocket was expanding against the captain's heart. She advanced slowly, carefully, listening for the moment when resistance changed. When the needle found the space between lung and chest wall. There. The hiss of air escaping sounded like relief. Like truth being released. The captain's oxygen saturation climbed immediately, 83, 87, 91. His heart rate dropped from 168 to 142. His blood pressure started rising, 82, 86, 89. The monitor's frantic beeping softened into something almost musical. Katie secured the catheter with tape, her movements efficient as a mechanism, and stepped back. The room didn't go silent. It went deeper than that. It went into the kind of stillness that happened when everyone realized they were watching the impossible happen in real time. Katie was checking the captain's pupils when a voice behind her whispered, "Where did a civilian learn to operate like a combat medic?" She turned. The surgical resident from Walter Reed, the one who'd been assisting during the captain's initial surgery 6 hours ago, was standing in the doorway in fresh scrubs, staring at Katie's hands like they'd just performed a resurrection. Katie didn't answer. She didn't need to. The young nurse was already staring at her differently too, the way you stare at someone after you've watched them become someone else. Get me a chest tube kit, Katie said, already moving to establish a proper airway before things deteriorated further. And call Dr. Hartmann in cardiothoracic. Tell him it's about the captain. He'll come. The next 10 hours were Katie's world, and she inhabited it completely. She stayed at the captain's bedside through the critical window, from 0200 until 1200 hours, 10 hours of monitoring every breath, every heartbeat, every number on every screen. She adjusted the chest tube when fluid started accumulating. She monitored his blood gases and ordered labs before anyone asked for them. She knew when he needed pain medication and when he needed something stronger, when his body was telling her it was ready to fight back, or when it needed more time to recover. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who'd kept people alive in conditions that would break most humans. In Helmand Province, in a forward operating base with inadequate supplies and mortar rounds hitting 50 meters away, she'd performed surgeries that should have failed and watched men open their eyes who shouldn't have survived the first cut. She'd run plasma through 4 lines while the building shook around her. She'd worked in the dark with only a headlamp and the sound of her own breathing to keep her company. This was easier. This was cleaner. This had electricity and monitors and actual medications. This was what she'd given up, and now, in this moment, with this captain's life hanging on every decision she made, it felt like coming home to a place she'd never meant to return to. A surgical resident, not the one from Walter Reed, a different one, came by at 0600 hours to check on the patient and found Katie still standing at the bedside, still in the same position, her scrubs damp with sweat from a night of work that most nurses couldn't sustain for an hour. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Since the code," Katie said, not looking away from the monitor. "You should rest. Let the day shift." "I'm staying." Something in her voice made him stop arguing. He left without another word. At 0730, the captain opened his eyes. It was the first time he'd been conscious since he arrived from Helmand Province 3 days ago. His pupils tracked Katie's face. His hand moved on the bed, fingers twitching toward her, and Katie positioned his arm so it rested against hers. She didn't speak. She just stood there, a witness, a guardian, a woman who'd been trained for exactly this moment and had been waiting 547 days to finally use it. By 1000 hours, his vitals were stable enough that the danger had passed into the realm of recovery. His O2 was holding at 96%. His heart rate was steady at 78. His blood pressure had climbed back to normal, 118/72. He was going to live. Katie was still there when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway at 1030 hours, his phone in his hand, his expression moving through several emotions in rapid succession, confusion, then something darker, then calculation. He watched Katie for a long moment, watched her hands adjusting the 4-line with the precision of someone who'd been trained by the best, watched the young ICU nurse treating her like she was something between a nurse and a legend. Then he turned and walked away, his phone already pressed against his ear. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the smile on his face as he left. The smile of someone who'd just found exactly what he needed. The smile on his face as he left the trauma bay wasn't triumph. It was recognition. The kind of smile a hunter wears when he's finally spotted the prey's weakness. Dr. Hargrove had watched Katie perform a procedure that no civilian nurse should know how to execute with that level of precision, and instead of awe, instead of respect, he saw only one thing, an opening. A way to reclaim the hierarchy she'd threatened, the authority she'd quietly eroded with every correct diagnosis, every intervention that made him look small. She'd saved the captain's life. That was the problem. Not because she'd failed, but because she'd succeeded in a way that exposed him. The Walter Reed escort had seen it. The surgical resident had seen it. By 0530 hours, when Katie finally left the bedside after 10 straight hours of monitoring, everyone in the hospital would know that Dr. Hargrove's ED wasn't run by its attending physician anymore. It was run by a nurse who moved like she'd been trained for exactly this. Hargrove didn't go home. He went to his office on the 3rd floor and locked the door. The morning sky was still dark outside his window, the city of Savannah quiet beneath the rain that had started around 0300. He sat behind his mahogany desk, expensive, purchased specifically to position him higher than anyone who sat across from it, and pulled up his phone contact list. Not the hospital directory. His personal list. The one marked with initials only. His real network. The people who understood that power wasn't something you announced. It was something you weaponized in whispers, in favors, in the kind of phone calls that happened when normal people were sleeping. He'd spent 15 years building this network. 3 board members who owed him professional courtesy extensions. 2 administrators who'd hired him based on his reputation. A hospital foundation director whose daughter he'd personally intervened for during a divorce custody battle. He started dialing at 05 for 5 hours, exactly as people would be waking up, checking their phones, drinking their first coffee. Richardson? Tom Hargrove. I need to discuss a personnel situation. His voice on the phone was different than his voice in the halls, smoother, more measured, the tone of a peer speaking to a peer. We have a nurse. Katie Morrison. She's been here for 6 months. Yesterday she performed an unauthorized medical procedure without physician supervision or protocol approval. The pause on the other end was exactly what he wanted. Concern. I'm not making accusations. I'm flagging a liability. The patient crashed. She intervened without calling a code. Needle decompression. At the second intercostal space. He let that sit. Richardson would know what that meant. Did we approve this? Did we have protocols for this? Because right now, we have a documentation trail that shows a nurse practicing medicine without a license, and Sacred Heart is exposed if something had gone wrong. If the family decides to sue. If the state board gets involved. Another pause. I'm just making sure we're protected. I'm sure it was well-intentioned. But intention doesn't protect a hospital. By the time he hung up, Richardson had already agreed to mention it in conversation with 2 other board members. The second call went to a former colleague at Mercer Medical Center. Tom, good to hear from you. The man's voice was genuinely warm. They trained together, climbed together, and when Tom had opportunities in Savannah, he'd made sure his friend knew. Favors were a 2-way street. I'm calling because I need a reference check. Katie Morrison. Worked at your facility before coming to Sacred Heart. How would you describe her clinical judgment? Any incidents that stand out? Tom let the man talk, then he redirected. The reason I ask is that we're investigating whether she might have overstepped her scope of practice. We need to establish a pattern. Did she seem like someone who had a tendency to practice beyond her licensing? The conversation lasted 5 minutes. By the end, Tom had planted exactly what he needed, the seed of doubt about a nurse's judgment, packaged in the language of professional concern. When he hung up, he'd created a shadow of a narrative, nothing that could be called a lie, but nothing that was quite the truth either. The third call went to the temp agency that had placed Katie 6 months ago. The receptionist transferred him to a supervisor. I'm reviewing an employee's file, he said calmly, and I noticed there's a significant gap in her professional history. Katie Morrison. She shows up in your system 18 months ago as a new licensed RN, but before that. He let the question hang. Can you tell me what she was doing? Where did she come from? Does she have references from before the nursing license? The supervisor was less helpful than he'd hoped, strict about privacy, but that didn't matter. Tom had already gotten what he needed, confirmation of the gap. A timeline that didn't add up. A history that was either redacted or non-existent. By 06:30 hours, he had 3 board members subtly concerned, a former colleague questioning Katie's judgment, and documentation of a gap in her background that he could frame however he needed. Then he called the investigator. Outside firm. They specialized in healthcare compliance violations, and they specialized in being thorough. I want a full protocol review, Tom said quietly. One of our nurses performed an unauthorized invasive procedure. Needle decompression for tension pneumothorax at 0200 hours. No physician order. No standing protocol. No supervisor notification until after the fact. I need documentation of what policies were violated and whether this constitutes practicing medicine without a license. The investigator asked the right questions. Tom answered them with precision, offering access to records, to the patient's chart, to witness statements. By lunchtime, the investigator was already in the hospital, requesting Katie's personnel file, her training records, her certification documentation, looking for any discrepancy, any deviation from scope of practice that could be documented and weaponized. Katie first learned about the investigation at 1,400 hours when HR called her into the office. Thin-faced woman named Sullivan who wouldn't make eye contact. "We've received a notification of a protocol review," Sullivan said, sliding a folder across her desk. "You performed a medical procedure on a patient without physician authorization or documentation. This is serious. The board is concerned about liability." Katie read the letter once. Then again. The words were deliberately vague: unauthorized medical intervention, scope of practice questions, potential licensing violations. But the meaning was clear. Someone had moved. Someone had decided she was worth eliminating. The letter gave her 72 hours to provide a written statement explaining her actions. She should have been terrified. Should have been calculating lawyers and defense strategies. But what she felt instead was something colder. Cleaner. The kind of clarity that comes from recognizing you're in a firefight. Her hands were steady as she read the letter a third time. "What happens now?" she asked Sullivan. "You're suspended pending investigation. Paid suspension, pending the outcome. You should contact a lawyer. The board will convene in emergency session if the investigator recommends termination." Sullivan finally made eye contact, and Katie saw something like pity there. "I'm sorry. This came from above my pay grade." Katie nodded once. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket. One measured breath. That was all the emotion she allowed herself in that office. When she stood to leave, her legs didn't shake. When she walked to her locker, her hands didn't tremble. She'd been ordered to disappear once before. Ordered to vanish into a civilian identity with a 7-month nursing license that didn't explain where she'd spent the previous 20 years. Ordered to maintain the lie for an indefinite period. And she'd done it. Had swallowed the whole truth of her service, her rank, her decorations, and lived as just another nurse in the system. The classified operation in Helmand Province had gone sideways. 3 Marines killed, 4 more wounded, and Katie had been the only surgical asset within 100 kilometers. She'd performed emergency surgery in a firefight while under direct fire herself, and when the exfil helicopter had arrived, the Pentagon had made a decision: she was no longer officially military. She was no longer officially anything. Her records were sealed. Her decorations classified. She was a ghost on paper, and if she tried to use the truth to defend herself now, she would be committing a federal crime. Rain started that evening, heavy enough that it hammered against the apartment windows like someone demanding entry. Katie sat in the dark, her laptop open to her professional email. 72 hours to respond to the investigation. 72 hours to defend herself without telling the truth. She could write a statement about her training, her expertise, her life-saving intervention. But every word would be a half-truth. Every defense would require the lie to hold. And the lie was a federal order. Breaking it meant prison time. Means betraying the 17 Marines she'd saved in Helmand, whose names were still classified, whose families still didn't know exactly what had happened in that convoy ambush, whose lives existed in a redacted file somewhere in the Pentagon. The next morning, she didn't go to the hospital. She cleaned her apartment instead. Methodical. Precise. By evening, she'd packed everything that mattered into a cardboard box from the storage closet. A cracked mug from her first deployment. A dying plant that the captain had been tending, that someone had left for her in the staff room as a thank you. A photograph of her and her spotter, taken in 2016, before the operation, before everything changed. The photo was the only visual record she had of his face, Danny Vasquez, petty officer 2nd class, who'd been killed in the ambush and buried with a name the news never mentioned because the mission was classified. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in newspaper, were the combat boots. Tan suede, scuffed from 100 operations, still stained with dust from Sanjin Valley. She'd brought them with her to Savannah. Had worn them under civilian clothes for 6 months like a talisman. Like proof that she was real. That the other version of her, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, actually existed. That she hadn't imagined those 20 years. On the third day, Friday morning, the hospital board sent her the formal notification. The investigator had recommended termination. The board would vote Monday. They were within protocol to make a final decision without her testimony if her response was deemed insufficient. She had until Monday at 0900 hours to submit a statement. Katie stared at the email, then closed her laptop. Outside, the rain had become intermittent, the worst of the storm had passed, but everything was still wet, the whole city dripping and exhausted. She left the apartment at 1600 hours with the cardboard box. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't leave a note. She just walked out into the damp Savannah afternoon and made her way to the nearest bus stop, 3 blocks away on Victory Drive. The rain started again as she waited, cold enough to sting. Water ran off her hair, mixed with tears she finally allowed herself because no one was watching. No one was here. No one knew who she was. The box was getting wet. The photograph of her and Danny was in there. The combat boots were getting soaked. She stood under the awning, holding the box like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality, and allowed herself to break for exactly 4 minutes. For minutes, because that's what discipline meant. You don't get more than 4 minutes. You don't get to dissolve. The headlights approached before she was finished. A sedan, slowing. The window rolled down and her teenage son's face appeared, rain streaming down his cheeks because he'd been crying too, had left school 2 hours early, had driven across the city looking for her because that's what children did when their parents became ghosts. "Mom, get in," he said, his voice shaking. She shook her head. "I can't explain. I just can't." He got out of the car anyway, standing in the rain in his school uniform. "Then I will," he said. And Katie realized in that moment that there was no hiding anymore. That the lie had an expiration date measured in hours. That sometimes the people you love don't ask for permission to save you. The hospital board convened in the main conference room at Sacred Heart, cameras mounted in the corners recording every angle for the disciplinary proceedings. Dr. Hargrove sat at the head of the mahogany table, his tailored suit pristine, his expression arranged into something approaching concern. 3 board members flanked him on either side, their leather portfolios stacked with documents, Katie Morrison's suspension notice, the investigator's report, statements from his allies. The fluorescent panels overhead cast everything in clinical white. The room smelled of furniture polish and institutional power. Nobody who walked through that door expected the next 47 seconds to dismantle a man's entire career. The doors burst open. Katie's teenage son stood in the doorway, breathing hard, holding a shadow box under his left arm and a classified government file folder clutched against his chest. His hand shook. Behind him, the security guard looked confused, uncertain whether to pull him back or let him proceed. The board members shifted in their chairs. Dr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. The boy's voice came out fractured but certain. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, United States Navy." The room went dead silent. He walked forward, and the sound of his shoes on the tile floor was the only noise. He opened the shadow box and laid it on the conference table. Inside, 3 medals caught the fluorescent light, ribbons in colors most people in that room had never seen up close. Bronze. Purple. Gold. He opened the folder with both hands, and the official seal of the Department of Defense faced the board like an indictment. A trembling nurse, one of the younger ICU staff who'd assisted with the needle decompression, took the folder with tears already streaming down her face. She read aloud, her voice breaking on every other word, "Combat deployments to Helmand Province. Surgical saves under fire in classified operations. 10-hour surgical procedures that saved 17 lives in austere field conditions. Multiple commendations for extraordinary valor." She looked up from the page, staring at Katie. "You saved all those people." A man stood in the back of the room. He wore civilian clothes, but his posture carried the weight of 1,000 operations. His shoulders were wider than the doorframe seemed to allow. A Navy SEAL, his presence like a tank idling in a quiet garage, all restrained power beneath an ordinary exterior. His voice came out steady and clean, Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. The board chairman leaned forward. Purple Heart. Another pause. The folder trembled in the young nurse's hands. Navy Commendation Medal for heroism in the Sanjin Valley when hostile fire prevented medical evacuation for 6 hours. His eyes locked on Katie. Senior Chief Morrison operated on my unit commander with incoming rounds striking the compound walls. She performed a resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta, a Reboa procedure, using field expedient equipment that shouldn't have worked. He walked out of Helmand Province because she refused to let him die. Katie stood motionless, her son's arm around her shoulders. She watched her past and present collide like two aircraft on a collision course, and she did not flinch. The Walter Reed surgical resident stood. I knew I recognized that technique. Senior Chief, you operated on my commander in Helmand Province. He's alive because of you. I've spent 3 years trying to match your precision with a scalpel. It's not something you teach, it's something you survive into. Dr. Hargrove's face had shifted from pale to a deep crimson. His mouth opened and closed. He looked at the board members he'd called in favors from, the physicians who'd laughed at his bets, the investigators he'd weaponized. They were all staring at Katie Morrison now, and their expressions ranged from awe to the particular shame that comes from realizing you've been complicit in something monstrous. You don't understand. Hargrove's voice cracked. She violated protocol. She practiced medicine without. The SEAL team leader stepped forward, and the air in the room seemed to change pressure. She saved Captain Miller's life at 2 in the morning when your physicians didn't answer their pages. She performed an emergency needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, with nothing but a 14-gauge angiocath and the kind of training you get when lives depend on your hands staying steady under fire. She did exactly what she was trained to do. The young ICU nurse spoke again, her voice no longer trembling but steady with the kind of courage that comes from watching someone you respect being destroyed. Dr. Hargrove, you told me not to page anyone else. You said the captain could wait until morning. You said she was just a nurse. The last 4 words hung in the air like a verdict. The FBI agent at the far end of the table made a note. 2 uniformed federal officers entered through the side door. Their badges read counterintelligence. The room contracted around them the way a held breath contracts before release. The senior officer stepped forward, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who didn't need to raise his volume. Dr. James Hargrove, Senior Chief Morrison's classified mission in Helmand Province has been partially declassified by FBI counterintelligence following evidence of federal witness tampering. Her military records have been restored as of 0600 this morning. Your interference with a protected witness has triggered a formal federal investigation into obstruction of justice and abuse of institutional power. You are remanded to the custody of hospital security pending federal transport. The hospital administrator stood slowly. She was a woman in her 60s, with the kind of presence that came from making difficult decisions in real time. She looked at Hargrove with an expression that mixed disappointment and something harder, the look of someone who'd trusted badly and wouldn't make that mistake twice. When she spoke, her voice cut through the room like a surgical instrument. Dr. Hargrove, you're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out of this facility. Your medical license suspension hearing is scheduled for next week. We'll be cooperating fully with the federal investigation. Security guards appeared at Hargrove's elbows. He stood, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked around the room for allies. The board members studied their notebooks. The physicians found the ceiling fascinating. Nobody met his eyes. His network, built over 15 years of carefully leveraged favors, had evaporated the moment his competence became irrelevant to a larger truth. As they escorted him toward the door, his path took him past Katie Morrison. He passed within 3 feet of her. She met his eyes with that same devastating calm she'd shown in the cafeteria when he'd knocked her tray to the floor. But this time, the calm wasn't a mask, it was a window. He saw, finally, what he'd missed from the beginning. Not weakness. Not a threat to his hierarchy. A warrior who'd survived things his institutional power couldn't protect him from. She'd held a man's abdomen closed while rounds impacted concrete. She'd operated in places where there was no backup, no board, no committee. She'd made decisions in the dark that meant 17 people walked out alive. Hargrove was just a doctor. The doors closed behind the security team. The silence lasted exactly 7 seconds. The board chairman cleared his throat. The position of Director of Emergency Medicine has been vacant for 18 months. We'd like to offer it to you, Senior Chief Morrison. Effective immediately. With a salary commensurate with your qualifications and a full apology from this institution. Katie's son squeezed her shoulder. She took one measured breath. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave, the same voice that had held steady in crisis, that had given orders under fire. I accept. With 3 conditions. 1. Any military personnel transferred to Sacred Heart from Walter Reed or overseas commands are prioritized for my trauma bay. 2. I want to hire 3 combat medic veterans as nursing staff. 3. I want a direct secure line to the Pentagon. The board chairman nodded without hesitation. All approved. 3 months later, someone spotted Dr. James Hargrove selling insurance policies from a folding table in a strip mall outside Savannah. His medical license permanently revoked. The federal investigation revealed he deliberately prevented patient care, instructing nurses not to page other physicians, withholding resources from the captain's care, all to protect his ego from a woman he'd mistaken for powerless. The irony was so sharp you could cut yourself on it. 6 months after the hearing, Katie Morrison walked through the emergency department of Sacred Heart Hospital. Her emergency department now. The nameplate on her office door read Director of Emergency Medicine, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, USN, Ret. She'd implemented new protocols in her first week. Combat casualty care principles adapted for civilian trauma. A trauma bay designed with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between life and death could be measured in seconds. She'd hired 3 combat medic veterans as nursing staff, people who understood that medicine was sometimes the bridge between survival and history. The young ICU nurse who'd trembled reading Katie's service record was now her protégé, learning procedures from someone who'd performed them under conditions that would break most people. The Walter Reed surgical resident had transferred to Sacred Heart specifically to work under Katie's leadership. Now, when trauma codes came through the ER doors, the attending physicians competed for the chance to scrub in under her guidance, because her teaching was legend. She didn't explain procedures, she showed you how survival worked. On her desk sat the shadow box her son had carried into that conference room, medals catching afternoon light. Beside it was a photograph of the Navy captain, the comatose man she'd saved during that 2 a.m. crisis. He was standing in dress blues now, recovered, fully active duty, his service record restored. He'd sent the photo with a handwritten note, "Thank you for the extra 10 hours. They made all the difference." And tucked in the corner of the office, no longer hidden in a cardboard box, were those worn combat boots. Scarred leather. Sand still caught in the bootlaces from Helmand Province. She kept them displayed not as a relic but as a reminder of who she'd been, of who she still was, of the line between the person the world saw and the person who saved lives when everything else failed. A new nurse, someone from outside, unfamiliar with Katie's history, walked into the office one afternoon and asked about the boots in the corner. Katie was reviewing surgical charts, her hand steady, her eyes tracking data with the precision of someone accustomed to processing information in seconds. She smiled, not the careful expression she'd worn as an ordinary nurse, but something real. A reminder, Katie said, of who I was. And who I still am. Her son visited after school most days now, sitting in her office doing homework while his mother reviewed patient files and implemented new trauma protocols. He didn't need to save her anymore. She didn't need to hide anymore. The past she'd buried in Helmand Province wasn't a liability waiting to destroy her, it was her strength, finally visible, finally honored. And when the attending physicians looked at Katie Morrison now, they didn't see a threat to hierarchy. They saw what she'd always been. They saw a warrior. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Comment below, would you have saved the captain or walked away? And if you haven't already, like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs.